Our first story comes from a seasoned trucker named Jake, who has been on the road for over 20 years. It was a cold, rainy night in the Midwest, and Jake was on a long-haul trip, driving down a stretch of highway he knew well. The rain was coming down in sheets, making visibility poor. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught a figure on the side of the road, a man standing alone, drenched, with his thumb out in a gesture that was all too familiar. Jake's first instinct was to keep driving. He'd heard too many horror stories about picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere. But something about the man's posture, the way he stood there, head down and shoulders slumped, made Jake reconsider. Maybe it was the loneliness of the road, or maybe he just felt sorry for the poor soul. Against his better judgment, Jake slowed down and pulled over. The man climbed into the cab without a word, dripping water onto the seat. He was dressed in old, ragged clothes that looked like they hadn't been dry in days. Jake tried to make small talk, asking where the man was headed, but the stranger remained silent, staring straight ahead. The silence grew uncomfortable, thick with unease. That's when Jake noticed the air inside the cab had turned icy cold, far colder than it should have been even with the rain outside. He glanced at the man again, and that's when he saw his eyes. They were completely black, like two dark pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. Jake's heart raced as he realized something was horribly wrong. He tried to keep his eyes on the road, but the atmosphere in the cab grew more oppressive with each passing mile. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, blaring static, and then, a voice, a woman's voice, faint and distant, calling out Jake's name. "Jake, Jake." It whispered, sending chills down his spine. The hitchhiker turned his head slowly toward Jake, a twisted smile creeping across his face. The voice on the radio grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost a scream. In a panic, Jake slammed on the brakes, sending the truck skidding to a halt. When he looked over at the passenger seat, the man was gone. The door hadn't opened, and there was no sign that anyone had ever been there, except for the puddle of water on the seat. Jake sat there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He knew he had picked up a hitchhiker, but now, he was alone. Shaken, Jake decided to drive on, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't really alone, that something was still watching him from the darkness of the cab. To this day, Jake refuses to pick up anyone on the side of the road, no matter how desperate they look. Our next story is about Mark, a trucker who had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight. Exhausted, he pulled into an isolated rest stop in the middle of the desert, far from any town or city. The place was desolate. Just a few dim lights flickering in the distance, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Mark parked his rig and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for what he hoped would be a quick nap, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Just as Mark was starting to drift off, a soft tapping sound echoed through the cab. He opened his eyes, thinking it was just the wind, but then the tapping came again. This time louder and more deliberate. It was coming from the passenger side window. Mark looked over and saw a man standing outside, staring at him with an unsettling smile. The man was tall, with wild hair and eyes that seemed too wide, too alert. His clothes were dirty and torn, like he'd been out in the desert for days. The smile never left his face as he continued to tap on the glass, each knock more insistent than the last. Mark sat up, every nerve in his body on edge. He considered opening the window to ask what the man wanted, but something in his gut told him not to. Instead, he just stared back, hoping the man would get the message and leave, but he didn't. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if the man was trying to break through the glass with his fingers. And then, without warning, the tapping stopped. The man's expression changed, the smile fading into a look of pure malice. He pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging up the glass, and then whispered something that Mark couldn't quite hear. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He reached for the door lock, but before he could react, the man vanished, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. Mark quickly locked all the doors and started the engine, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He was about to pull away when he glanced at the passenger window again. There, pressed into the glass, was the outline of the man's face, his eyes, his nose, his mouth, all etched into the window as if it had been burned into the glass. Mark didn't stay to find out what it meant. He floored the gas and sped out of the rest stop, never looking back. He didn't stop until he reached a well-lit truck stop miles away, surrounded by other drivers. Even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man's eyes were still on him, watching from the darkness, waiting for another chance to get closer. Sarah had been a trucker for a few years, and she had always preferred traveling in a convoy when driving through remote areas. There was safety in numbers, or so she thought. On this particular night, she was part of a convoy of 5 trucks heading through a remote mountain pass. The route was treacherous, winding through narrow roads with steep drops on either side. As they climbed higher into the mountains, fog began to roll in, thick and impenetrable. Soon, Sarah could barely see the taillights of the truck in front of her. The fog grew denser with every passing minute, turning the world outside her windshield into a white void. The radio crackled with static, making it difficult to communicate with the other drivers. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she tried to focus on the faint glow of the taillights ahead. But then, one by one, those taillights began to disappear, swallowed by the fog. The voices on the radio fell silent, leaving Sarah alone in the eerie stillness. Panic began to set in as Sarah realized she could no longer see the other trucks. It was as if the convoy had vanished into thin air. She slowed down, hoping to catch sight of them, but the fog was too thick. The road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Sarah's heart raced as she started to feel like she was driving in circles, trapped in some kind of endless loop. That's when she noticed something strange. There were lights up ahead, but they weren't the taillights of the convoy. They were dim, flickering, and they seemed to be coming from above, like lanterns hanging in the air. Curiosity got the better of her, and Sarah decided to investigate. She followed the lights, her truck crawling along the winding road. The fog parted just enough for her to see that the lights were leading her toward a narrow side road that wasn't on her map. Against her better judgment, Sarah turned onto the road, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the lights. The further she went, the stranger things became. The trees along the roadside seemed to bend toward her, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. The road itself seemed to twist and warp, narrowing until it was barely wide enough for her truck to pass. Finally, the light stopped at what appeared to be an old, abandoned town, hidden deep within the mountains. The buildings were crumbling, overtaken by the forest, and the streets were eerily silent. Sarah's headlights barely penetrated the darkness as she drove through the empty town, her sense of dread growing with every turn. She felt like she was being watched, though she couldn't see anyone. The lights flickered out one by one, leaving her in complete darkness. Panic set in as she tried to turn the truck around, but the road had disappeared, replaced by dense trees that closed in around her. Sarah fumbled with the radio, trying to call for help, but all she heard was static. And then, through the static, she heard voices, whispers that grew louder, more insistent. They called her name, urging her to get out of the truck and come closer. Sarah felt paralyzed with fear, her hands shaking as the whispers became deafening. She knew she had to leave. But the truck wouldn't start, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with its weight. Just when she thought she was lost for good, a blinding light suddenly pierced the darkness, cutting through the fog. Sarah shielded her eyes and saw the other trucks from the convoy, their headlights blazing as they emerged from the mist. Relief washed over her as she quickly followed them, leaving the strange town behind. But as she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw something that sent a chill down her spine. A figure standing in the middle of the road, watching her with glowing eyes. The convoy never spoke of what happened that night, and Sarah still wonders if she had been lured